All right, let's do this. Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Absolutely. Always excited to unpack these mysteries, especially with a fresh set of eyes.
Well, you've been taking notes on season 2 of From,
Yeah.
and let me tell you, they're impressively detailed.
Can't help but get pulled in, you know?
Yeah.
This show just stays with you.
It really does, and your notes are the perfect guide for this deep dive. So, shall we?
Let's dive in. Where should we start?
Well, you were really drawn to the show's visuals, how they create that constant sense of unease. You've mentioned the cinematography in your notes.
Oh, absolutely. The way they frame those shots, the characters always seem boxed in. It's claustrophobic, even in the wide open spaces.
Like that scene, where Boyd is in the woods.
In episode 4.
Yeah, episode 4. He's walking, and the camera is constantly framing him between these really, really tight shots of the tree trunks.
Yes, it's like the woods themselves are closing in on him.
Exactly.
And it makes you think of Mr. Robot, you know? The way they use those tight close-ups on Elliot, those low ceilings, all those computer screens surrounding him.
Right.
It's all very deliberate, very intentional, visual storytelling at its finest.
So if we tie this back to From, is that feeling of being trapped, both physically and mentally, is that
Yeah.
really what the show's getting at?
Right, because it's not just the town, is it? It's the fear, the suspicion, even the relationships.
Okay, so speaking of relationships, let's talk about those new characters who arrived in town. What'd you make of them?
The newcomers. Always interesting to see how a show introduces fresh faces.
You had some mixed feelings about them, right?
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? New characters can either breathe life into a show or completely derail it.
It's true, like that classic trope. You throw in some new faces to stir up the drama.
Exactly, a classic for a reason. Sometimes it works, sometimes.
Sometimes it just feels, I don't know, a little bit convenient.
Exactly.
So did these new characters in From, did they add to the story or just complicate things?
Well, that's the question, isn't it? And it seems like you honed in on that dynamic between Tabitha and Victor.
You're right. I mean, their whole story, finding common ground in the midst of all that chaos.
It's interesting, though, because it's not like they just seamlessly integrated into the group.
No, not
But it's
bad.
also not like they completely disrupted everything. It's this weird middle ground.
It's almost like, have you ever been on like a group trip and everything's fine, but then like tensions start to rise? This is like that, but with way higher stakes. So I'm curious, did their dynamic, particularly between those two, did it amplify the tension or did it distract from it?
That's a good question. What do you think?
I'm leaning towards amplify only because it's not just about whether they trust the new people, it's about whether they can even trust their own judgment anymore.
It makes you question everything you thought you knew about the town, about survival.
Exactly. And that's where From gets you thinking. It uses these classic tropes, but then it like flips them on their head.
And it makes you ask those deeper questions about human nature. And speaking of human nature, we can't forget about Boyd.
Oh, Boyd.
Yeah.
Your notes on him, they were all over the place this season.
As they should be. The writers really put him through the ringer, didn't they?
It was intense.
Right.
Like 1 minute, he's the voice of reason. The next, he's, well,
Injecting himself with worm juice.
exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, where did that even come from?
That's where I think the show starts to divide its audience. You mentioned struggling with the pacing this season.
Yeah.
And I think that's a valid point. Some of Boyd's actions, they felt, I don't know, unearned.
Yeah. Like they were going for shock value over substance.
Right. Like that whole torch in the dungeon thing. It just felt a little rushed, didn't it?
It did. Like
Yeah.
they wanted to get to the next big twist without really explaining, why he would even do that in the first place.
Exactly. And it's interesting because your notes, they actually touch on this. You were really intrigued by Boyd using the worms to fight the creatures.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
But you also questioned his methods.
Right.
Yes.
Because it's like, how far is too far?
Exactly. Can you fight monsters without becoming one yourself?
This is such a Boyd question, right?
Absolutely. It's like the core of his character arc. But
Yeah.
this season, they really pushed it to the limit.
It did feel like they were pushing the limits this season. And that whole blood connection thing, like what was that about?
Right. Those cryptic hints about his connection to the creatures. Some people think he's going to turn into one of them.
Oh, wow.
Others think it's more symbolic,
Yeah.
representing the darkness inside him.
I think for me, and this is something I noticed in my notes, Boyd's storyline, it kind of felt like the show itself was struggling with how much to reveal,
Interesting.
Like you want answers, but you also don't want the mystery to be ruined.
It's that balance, holding back just enough to keep you hooked.
Exactly. And speaking of hooked, that ending, talk about a cliffhanger.
Tabitha in the hospital bed. Yeah, that threw me for a loop.
Seriously. One minute she's in those caves, the next she's waking up in like this sterile white room.
It was jarring.
It was like a whole different show.
But it also felt inevitable, didn't it? Like all those weird visions she was having, all those close calls, they had to lead somewhere.
Right. It's like this show is saying, okay, you want to talk about reality? Let's talk about reality.
Because what is reality at this point? Is she back in the real world? Is it all just a dream? A simulation?
That's what I want to know. They leave you with more questions than answers.
Yeah.
That cut to black, and then you just see the town again. It's like, did anything even change?
It's like that feeling you get when you wake up from a nightmare, but you're not sure if you're really awake yet. You know what I mean?
It's unsettling, to say the least.
Mm.
But in a way, it's also what makes From so compelling.
Absolutely. It's that constant push and pull, the fear of the unknown, but also the desire to understand it.
And those camera angles, those tight shots you were talking about earlier, they play into that too. Even if Tabitha's out, is she really free? Or is she still trapped in her own head?
Ooh, now that's an interesting thought. Because it's like the show is saying, sure, you can escape the physical, but the mental, that's a whole other story.
It really makes you appreciate the layers, you know? Even with all the twists and turns, From never lets you go.
It stays with you. Like a bad dream, but in a good way.
Exactly. But speaking of those twists, we have to admit, some of them left us a little, I don't know.
Confused.
Yeah. Like, we're all for ambiguity. But there were moments this season that felt more like head-scratchers than satisfying reveals.
The pacing definitely felt off at times.
Agreed. It's like they were so eager to get to the next shocking moment that they forgot to, let things breathe a little.
I think that's where From sometimes trips itself up, trying to do too much too quickly.
But even when it stumbles, it never loses that core element of human connection, of exploring what it really means to face the unknown, not just out there, but within ourselves.
Which is what makes it so relatable, right? We're all just trying to find our way to make sense of the chaos. And From reminds us that even when things get really, really weird, we're not alone.
Well said. And on that note, as we eagerly anticipate news of a third season, fingers crossed, I just want to say it's been a pleasure dissecting these mysteries with you.
The pleasure is all mine. Your notes, they were like a roadmap to all the best parts of the show, all the little details I missed.
Well, you were the one who connected all the dots, who helped us see the bigger picture. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this has given you plenty to ponder as we wait for the next chapter in the strange and unsettling world of From. Until then, keep those series coming, and remember, sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones we create ourselves.